Before we begin, let us know where you're listening from. After the story, rate it from 1 to 10. Now let's start. Vienna, 1899. Dawn broke over the Hofburg Palace with a tender persistence, light cascading through the tall windows of the imperial residence. Inside, the servants moved silently across marble floors, preparing for another day in the Austrian Empire's epicenter of power. Among them, 20-year-old Daria Voss slipped through the corridors with practiced invisibility, her brown work dress blending with the shadows, her eyes downcast as protocol demanded. She carried a silver tray of correspondence to the private study of Emperor Franz Joseph's personal secretary, her footsteps barely audible. 6 months she had worked in the palace, and still she marveled at how the grand corridors made her feel both insignificant and part of something eternal. The weight of history pressed down upon her shoulders with each step. "You there, girl?" A sharp voice cracked through the morning quiet. Daria turned, careful not to disturb the precisely arranged letters. "Yes, Baroness Keller?" She kept her eyes respectfully lowered before the Emperor's aunt, a woman whose tongue was said to be sharper than any sword in the imperial armory. The elderly noblewoman approached, her walking stick tapping an impatient rhythm against the parquet flooring. "You've arranged these improperly." She gestured to the tray. "The imperial correspondence always goes on top, then diplomatic communications, then domestic matters. Has no one taught you the proper protocols?" "I apologize, Baroness." Daria felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I was instructed to." "You were instructed poorly, then." The Baroness rearranged the letters with her bony fingers. "This palace functions on order, girl. Without it, empires fall. Remember that." "Yes, Baroness." Daria kept her expression neutral, though her stomach tightened. Another mistake. Another opportunity for dismissal. Her widowed mother and 3 younger siblings depended on her modest wages. As the Baroness swept away, Daria heard whispers from 2 ladies-in-waiting passing by. "Is that the one they call the Sparrow?" one asked. "Yes, the plain one from the city. They say her father was some sort of failed academic who died in debt. How desperate the household staff must be to take in such creatures." Daria continued her walk, the familiar ache of invisibility settling between her shoulder blades. She had grown accustomed to being overlooked, to existing in the spaces between notice. Her father, Professor Anton Voss, had once told her that true strength lay in observation, in understanding the currents of power rather than swimming in them. Before consumption claimed him, leaving behind nothing but books and debts. At the secretary's office, she found the door ajar. She knocked gently. "Enter," came a voice, but not the one she expected. Daria stepped inside and froze. Standing by the window was not the secretary, but Emperor Franz Joseph himself, resplendent in his military uniform despite the early hour. At 69, the emperor carried himself with the rigid discipline of a lifetime of duty. His famous whiskers were now mostly white, but his eyes remained sharp and alert. She immediately dropped into a deep curtsy, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Your Imperial Majesty, forgive the intrusion. I was delivering the morning correspondence." The emperor regarded her with mild curiosity. "You may place it on the desk. Her Muller has been called away on urgent business." "Yes, Your Majesty." Daria carefully set the tray down, acutely aware of every movement. As she arranged the letters according to the Baroness's instructions, she felt the emperor's gaze upon her. "You corrected the order," he observed. "Baroness Keller's doing, I presume?" Daria looked up in surprise, then quickly lowered her eyes again. "Yes, Your Majesty." The Baroness is meticulous in matters of protocol. Something in his tone suggested a lifetime of negotiating his aunt's rigid standards. "Your name, girl?" "Daria Voss, Your Majesty." "Voss." He seemed to consider the name. "Any relation to Professor Anton Voss of the university?" The question struck her like a physical blow. "My father, Your Majesty." "Oh." The emperor nodded. "I recall his monograph on the Austro-Hungarian linguistic traditions. Quite illuminating." Daria stared, momentarily forgetting her place. Her father's work had reached the emperor's hands, the same treatises that had been dismissed by the university board as unnecessarily progressive and lacking practical application. "Thank you, Your Majesty." She hesitated, then added, "He would have been honored to know you read his work. Knowledge rarely receives its due recognition in its time." The emperor moved to the desk and picked up a letter from the top of the pile. That will be all, Fräulein Voss. Daria curtsied again and backed toward the door, her mind reeling from the encounter. As she reached for the handle, the emperor spoke again. The Baroness is correct about protocol, but your father was correct about the Hungarian dialects. Remember that, too. Yes, your majesty. Outside in the corridor, Daria pressed a hand to her chest, steadying her breathing. In 6 months of service, she had glimpsed the emperor only from afar, a distant figure moving through formal gardens or disappearing into carriages. To have spoken with him directly, to have heard him speak of her father's work with appreciation. She had no time to process the encounter before Mrs. Hoffman, the head housekeeper, appeared at the end of the hall, gesturing impatiently. Daria hurried to her next task, tucking the moment away like a precious jewel to examine later, in private. Xavier Rothenberg stood at the edge of the emperor's council chamber, recording the minutes of the meeting with practiced efficiency. At 32, he had served as undersecretary to the imperial cabinet for 3 years, his keen mind and remarkable memory making him indispensable to the aging statesman who guided the empire's affairs. The meeting droned on, discussions of industrial unrest in Bohemia, nationalist stirrings in Hungary, and the ever-present tensions with Russia dominating the agenda. Xavier's pen moved steadily across the page, capturing every word while his mind catalogued the subtext beneath them. "And what of the cultural initiatives proposed for the Millennium celebrations?" asked Count Harak, the Minister of Culture. Foreign Minister Galachowski sighed audibly. "With all due respect, Count, perhaps we could address matters of actual imperial significance before discussing concerts and exhibitions?" The emperor, who had been listening silently, raised a hand. "The millennium marks 1,000 years of Hungarian kingship under the crown of St. Stephen. It is not merely cultural frippery, but a critical opportunity to demonstrate the unity of our dual monarchy. We will discuss it." Xavier noted the exchange with particular attention. Few understood as well as the emperor how the threads of culture bound the disparate nationalities of the empire together, or how quickly those bonds could fray. As the council finally adjourned 3 hours later, Xavier organized his notes when a voice addressed him. "Rothenberg, a moment." He turned to find the emperor waiting, the council chamber now empty save for them. Xavier bowed. "Your Imperial Majesty. Walk with me." The emperor moved toward the doors that led to the private imperial gardens. "Your notes from today's meeting. I want them transcribed by tomorrow morning, with particular attention to the Hungarian matters." "Of course, your majesty." They stepped out into the gardens, where late spring had coaxed vibrant color from the carefully tended flower beds. The emperor paused by a bench, gazing at a spray of white roses. "The empress loved these," he said quietly, an unusual personal observation from a man known for his reserve. The mention of Empress Elizabeth, assassinated the previous year by an Italian anarchist, still cast a pall over the court. "They're beautiful, your majesty." The emperor seemed to remember himself. "You studied linguistics at university, did you not, Rothenberg?" "Yes, your majesty. Among other subjects." "Then you may be familiar with Professor Voss's work on the empire's linguistic diversity." Xavier nodded. His research on Hungarian Germanic language patterns was groundbreaking, if controversial. His daughter works in the palace now. A curious circumstance. Xavier recalled seeing a young woman in the servants' quarters who kept to herself, often reading when others socialized. The quiet one with the serious eyes. The emperor's gaze sharpened. "You've noticed her then?" "Only in passing, your majesty." Xavier felt suddenly uncomfortable, as if he had revealed something unintended. "I am considering a project. The Millennium celebrations provide an opportunity to commission a comprehensive study of our empire's cultural and linguistic heritage, something that might bridge understanding between our various peoples." The emperor clasped his hands behind his back. "Professor Voss began such work before his death. I wonder if his research notes survive." Xavier understood immediately. "You wish me to speak with his daughter?" "Discreetly. The girl seems intelligent, but her position is delicate. If her father's work proves valuable, arrangements could be made to properly compensate the family." The emperor's expression remained impassive. "Consider it a matter of imperial cultural preservation." "I understand, your majesty." As Xavier departed, he considered the unusual assignment. The emperor rarely took personal interest in such matters, delegating cultural initiatives to his ministers. What had prompted this particular concern? And why involve a palace servant? Finding Fräulein Voss proved easier than expected. The following afternoon, Xavier spotted her in the palace library, dusting shelves with careful attention to the ancient volumes. He observed her for a moment before approaching. She moved with quiet efficiency, occasionally pausing to glance at a title or run a finger gently along a particularly fine binding. Fräulein Voss. She started, nearly dropping her cloth. Sir, I apologize, I was just finishing here. Her voice was soft but clear, her German carrying the slight lilt of someone raised in Vienna's academic quarters. No need for apologies. I am Xavier Rothenberg, undersecretary to the imperial cabinet. He offered a slight bow. Might I have a word with you? Wariness flickered across her features. A servant summoned by an imperial official rarely received good news. Of course, sir. I understand you are Professor Anton Voss's daughter. Her shoulders straightened almost imperceptibly. Yes, sir. His Majesty has expressed interest in your father's research, particularly his work on the Empire's linguistic patterns. Do you know if his papers and notes were preserved after his passing? The question clearly surprised her. Yes, I have them. My father's collection is still intact, though we had to move to smaller quarters after. She didn't finish the sentence. Xavier nodded. His Majesty is considering a cultural project related to the Millennium celebrations. Your father's research could prove valuable to the Empire. Hope and suspicion warred in her expression. My father's work was dismissed by the university. They called it divisive. Times change, Fräulein Voss. What once seemed divisive may now be seen as insightful. He lowered his voice. The Emperor himself remembered your father's monograph on Austro-Hungarian linguistics. She blinked rapidly, processing this information. What exactly would be required of me, Herr Rothenberg? Initially, simply access to your father's notes and papers. If they prove useful, there may be a more formal arrangement. You would, of course, be compensated for any materials used. Daria hesitated, and Xavier recognized the calculation behind her eyes, the weighing of opportunity against risk, hope against experience. I would need to review the papers first, she said finally. Some are quite personal. Family matters. Of course, I wouldn't expect otherwise. And I would need to explain this to my mother. She's been protective of his legacy since the university's rejection affected him so deeply. Xavier studied her face, noting the quiet dignity that seemed at odds with her station. Your loyalty to your father's memory is commendable, Fräulein Voss. It's all we have left of him, sir. The simple statement carried a weight that resonated unexpectedly within Xavier. I understand. He reached into his coat and produced a card. My office is on the 3rd floor of the East Wing. When you've had time to consider, you may leave word with my secretary. As she accepted the card, their fingers brushed briefly. Xavier noticed how work-worn her hands were, yet they handled the card with the delicacy one might afford a rare manuscript. Thank you, Herr Rothenberg. She tucked the card into her apron pocket. I will consider it carefully. He nodded and turned to leave, but paused. Your father's theories on cultural integration through linguistic understanding. They were ahead of their time. In today's empire, such thinking might find a more receptive audience. Something flickered in her eyes, a spark of the academic passion she must have inherited from her father. He believed that understanding begins with language, that to truly know a people, one must speak as they speak. A profound insight, Xavier said, and one this empire might well need in the coming years. As he walked away, Xavier found himself unexpectedly intrigued, not just by the potential of Professor Voss's research, but by the daughter who guarded it with such quiet determination. There was something compelling about her reserved manner, about eyes that observed everything while revealing so little. It was, he realized, the same quality that had made him excel in diplomatic circles, the ability to see without being seen, to understand without being understood. 3 days passed before Daria appeared at Xavier's office, a small leather portfolio clutched in her hands. She had changed from her work dress into a modest blue walking dress, clearly her best attire, though it showed signs of careful mending. Fräulein Voss, Xavier greeted her, rising from his desk. Please sit. Thank you for seeing me, Herr Rothenberg. She remained standing, her posture reflecting the awkwardness of her situation. A servant meeting an official outside the usual hierarchy of palace life. I've brought some of my father's papers, a selection that might demonstrate the scope of his work. Xavier gestured again to the chair. Please, be comfortable. This meeting is academic in nature, not a matter of palace service. She hesitated, then sat primly on the edge of the chair, placing the portfolio on the desk between them. My mother was reluctant at first. She feared his work might again be misunderstood or used to support policies he would have opposed. A reasonable concern. Xavier sat across from her. What changed her mind? I told her that the emperor himself had spoken of my father's work. That perhaps now, someone might finally listen. She opened the portfolio, revealing meticulously organized notes and diagrams. These are copies of his central theories and some supporting research. The originals remain at home. Xavier nodded approvingly at her caution. Prudent. He began to examine the papers, impressed by the professor's methodical approach. Maps showed linguistic distribution across the empire, with detailed notes on regional variations and historical evolution. Charts tracked patterns of cultural exchange through shared vocabulary. The work was impressive in its scope and vision. Your father saw the empire as a linguistic ecosystem, Xavier observed, looking up to find Daria watching him intently. Yes, he believed that forced assimilation created resistance, while natural language exchange fostered understanding. Her voice gained confidence as she spoke of her father's work. These marginalia detail his observations in Hungarian communities where German was introduced through trade rather than decree. Xavier turned a page and found a different handwriting interspersed with the professor's. These notes, they're not your father's. A flush colored Daria's cheeks. No, those are mine. I continued some of his field observations after he became too ill to travel. The communities knew him, trusted him. They allowed me to record their stories. You speak Hungarian? And Czech, some Polish, and a little Romanian. She straightened slightly. My father believed in practical application, not just theory. Xavier looked at her with newfound respect. The servant girl who disappeared into palace shadows was revealing herself as something quite different. Did you intend to follow in his academic footsteps? Pain flickered across her features. That path closed when he died. The university has little interest in women scholars, and even less in those without financial means or social standing. The quiet resignation in her voice stirred something in Xavier. He had navigated the imperial bureaucracy through intelligence and diligence, but he had started with advantages, family connections, education, the doors that opened for men of certain background and bearing. Daria Voss had none of these. These are excellent, Fräulein Voss. He closed the portfolio carefully. I believe His Majesty would find them most valuable. Would you be willing to assist further in this project? To help interpret your father's methodology and perhaps contribute your own observations? Hope and caution warred in her expression. In what capacity, Herr Rothenberg? As a research assistant to the Cultural Committee for the Millennium Celebrations. It would require discretion, of course. The arrangements would need to accommodate your current duties, at least initially. You mean I would continue as a servant while doing this work? The question held no bitterness, only pragmatic clarity. For now, yes. The situation is complicated by matters of protocol and precedent. Xavier leaned forward. But your contribution would be properly acknowledged and compensated. And if the work proves as valuable as I suspect, other arrangements might be possible in the future. Daria was silent for a moment, weighing his words. My father always said that recognition mattered less than the work itself. That understanding between peoples was its own reward. A noble sentiment, Xavier said. But practical matters cannot be ignored. Your family's circumstances, we manage. Her chin lifted slightly. But yes, additional income would ease many burdens. Then we have an agreement? We do. She stood, smoothing her skirt with hands that trembled slightly. When would you like to begin? I'll need to inform His Majesty and make the necessary arrangements. Shall we meet again in 3 days' time? Same hour. I'll request permission from Mrs. Hoffman for a brief absence. She reached for the portfolio, but Xavier placed his hand over it. With your permission, I'd like to show these to His Majesty first. I'll ensure their safe return. Daria hesitated, then nodded. Please handle them carefully. They're all that remains of his life's work. You have my word. Xavier rose and escorted her to the door. Fräulein Voss, your father would be proud of how you've preserved his legacy. She turned to him, a smile transforming her serious features for the first time. Thank you, Herr Rothenberg. That means a great deal. As she departed, Xavier found himself watching her longer than necessary, struck by how differently she carried herself when speaking of her father's work, how the invisible servant girl became visible when her passion and intelligence were engaged. The emperor had been right to take an interest. There was indeed more to Daria Voss than anyone had bothered to see. Summer bloomed across Vienna, the city parks filling with music and laughter as the imperial capital embraced the warmth. Within the palace walls, life continued its carefully ordered rhythms, though for Daria, everything had changed. 3 evenings each week, she now slipped away from her servant's duties to meet with Xavier Rothenberg in a small study adjoining the palace library. There, surrounded by maps and manuscripts, they worked to transform her father's research into something that might serve the empire's future. The Hungarian delegation arrives next week, Xavier said one evening as they reviewed cultural protocol documents. Count Andrusy has particular concerns about how the Millennium celebrations will portray Hungarian autonomy within the dual monarchy. Daria nodded, making a note in the margins of her father's text. His concerns aren't unfounded. The 1867 compromise established Hungary as equal to Austria under the crown, but many Hungarians feel the relationship remains unbalanced. You understand the politics well for someone who... Xavier stopped himself. For a servant girl? Daria finished, her tone more amused than offended. Over the weeks of their collaboration, formality had gradually given way to a more candid exchange. I was going to say, for someone not directly involved in court politics. My father hosted many discussions among academics and political thinkers in our home. Children are excellent observers when adults forget they're present. She closed the book before her. Besides, the best way to remain invisible is to understand the world you're invisible within. Xavier studied her face in the lamplight. You're hardly invisible anymore, Fräulein Voss. The emperor himself has twice requested your specific insights on the cultural presentation materials. Color rose in her cheeks at the reminder. It still seems unreal. Sometimes I fear I'll wake tomorrow to find this has all been an elaborate dream. I assure you, it's quite real. Xavier gathered papers into a portfolio. Which reminds me, His Majesty has approved a formal stipend for your research contribution. It will be arranged through my office to avoid unnecessary questions. Daria's eyes widened. That's most generous. It's earned. Xavier's voice was firm. Your insights on integrating cultural recognition without inflaming nationalist sentiments have been invaluable. The Emperor was particularly impressed by your suggestion for the linguistic heritage exhibition. She looked down, clearly uncomfortable with the praise. It was my father's concept. I merely applied it to the current situation. You do that often, you know. Do what? Diminish your own contributions. Xavier leaned back in his chair. Your father's work provided a foundation, yes. But your understanding of how to apply those principles in our current political climate, that's entirely your own achievement. Daria was silent for a moment, her fingers tracing the embossed pattern on a book cover. When you've spent years being overlooked, you learn not to expect recognition. It becomes safer to attribute any merit to someone else. The admission stirred something protective in Xavier. Over their weeks of collaboration, he had watched her gradually emerge from the protective shell of invisibility she had cultivated. Each time she offered an insight without first apologizing for speaking. Each time she defended a position with quiet confidence rather than hesitant suggestion, he felt a peculiar pride that both pleased and troubled him. Your circumstances have changed, Daria, he said quietly, using her given name for the first time. Perhaps the habits formed in those circumstances should change as well. She looked up, startled by the intimacy of his address. Perhaps they should. Xavier. The sound of his name on her lips created a moment of charged silence between them, broken only when the clock in the hallway chimed 9. Daria rose quickly. I should go? Mrs. Hoffman expects all staff in quarters by past. Of course. Xavier stood as well, gathering the materials they had been reviewing. Tomorrow we should focus on the musical program. Your suggestions for incorporating regional folk traditions alongside classical compositions were quite inspired. As she reached for her shawl, their hands brushed. Neither pulled away immediately, the brief contact lingering a heartbeat longer than propriety dictated. Good night, Xavier. Good night, Daria. She slipped from the room like a shadow, leaving Xavier alone with the lingering scent of lavender water and the troubling awareness that their professional collaboration had begun to blur into something more complex. He was an imperial undersecretary with diplomatic aspirations. She was a palace servant with an academic mind trapped by circumstance. The distance between their worlds was measured not just in social standing, but in the fundamental realities of imperial society. To acknowledge the growing connection between them would be to invite complications neither could afford. And yet, as he extinguished the lamps and locked away their work, Xavier found himself already anticipating tomorrow's meeting with an eagerness that had nothing to do with Hungarian musical traditions. The Hungarian delegation's arrival transformed the palace atmosphere. Elaborate formal dinners, diplomatic meetings, and cultural exchanges filled the imperial calendar as the dual monarchy navigated the delicate politics of celebration. For Daria, the increased activity meant more demanding servant duties alongside her research work, leaving her exhausted but exhilarated. "You look tired," Xavier observed when they met in their usual study one evening. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and she moved with the careful precision of someone conserving energy. The Countess Festetics required assistance with her correspondence until well past midnight. Daria stifled a yawn. Apparently, Hungarian aristocrats never sleep. Xavier smiled. They're known for their passionate approach to both politics and pleasure. He hesitated, then added, "Perhaps we should postpone tonight's work. You need rest." "No." Daria straightened, determination overcoming fatigue. "The cultural exhibition opens in 3 weeks. We still have the Romanian and Croatian sections to finalize." "Always the dutiful one," Xavier murmured, but there was admiration in his tone. They worked in companionable silence for a time, the scratch of pens and rustle of papers the only sounds. Outside, a summer storm gathered, occasional thunder punctuating their concentration. "Listen to this," Daria said suddenly, looking up from a document. "Count Andrusy writes that the millennium celebrates not Hungarian subjugation to Vienna, but 1,000 years of Hungarian sovereignty under our own crown, now worn by a Habsburg whose Hungarian loyalty must equal his Austrian birth." Xavier grimaced. Diplomatic phrasing has never been the Count's strength. "But he's not wrong," Daria countered. "The Hungarian nobility sees the emperor as their king by choice, not conquest. The distinction matters deeply to them. It creates an impossible balancing act for His Majesty. Appear too Hungarian to the Austrians, and he risks alienating his traditional power base. Appear too Austrian to the Hungarians, and he inflames nationalist sentiment. Which is why cultural recognition matters so much," Daria said passionately. "Language, music, traditions, these are the threads that can bind without strangling. My father always said." A particularly loud thunderclap interrupted her, followed by the sudden extinguishing of their lamps as the wind gusted through the windows. Darkness enveloped them, broken only by occasional flashes of lightning. "Stay where you are," Xavier said, rising carefully. "I'll find matches." He moved through the familiar room by memory and touch, locating the matchbox on the mantelpiece. As lightning illuminated the room in brief, ghostly flashes, he caught glimpses of Daria still seated at the table, her profile serene despite the storm's drama. The match flared, and Xavier relit the nearest lamp. Its warm glow pushed back the darkness, creating an intimate circle that seemed to separate them from the world outside. Rain now lashed against the windows, its steady rhythm strangely soothing. "Better?" he asked, returning to the table. Daria nodded, but Xavier noticed she was shivering slightly. Without thinking, he removed his jacket and moved to place it around her shoulders. "You're cold." "I'm fine, really," she began, but stopped as the weight of his jacket settled around her. "Thank you." The simple domesticity of the gesture struck them both simultaneously. This was not the action of an imperial official toward a research assistant. It was the instinctive care of a man for a woman who had come to matter to him. Xavier should have returned to his seat. Protocol, propriety, and prudence all demanded it. Instead, he remained standing beside her chair, acutely aware of her upturned face in the lamplight, of the way her breath quickened slightly at his proximity. "Daria," he said softly, her name a question in itself. She met his gaze steadily, something resolute forming in her expression. "We shouldn't." "No," he agreed. "We shouldn't." Neither moved away. "There are boundaries that exist for reasons beyond mere tradition," she continued, her voice barely audible above the rain. "They protect people like me from hoping for impossible things." "What do you hope for?" Xavier asked, needing to hear her speak the words he could not bring himself to say first. Lightning flashed, illuminating the vulnerability in her eyes. "For someone to see me. Not the servant girl, not the professor's daughter, not the useful mind. Just me." The simple truth of her admission undid him. Xavier reached out, his fingers gently brushing her cheek in a touch so light it might have been imagined. "I see you, Daria Voss." She closed her eyes briefly at his touch, then opened them with newfound clarity. "And I see you, Xavier Rothenberg. Which is why I know this cannot continue." She stood, slipping his jacket from her shoulders and holding it out to him. The professional distance she had maintained throughout their collaboration had returned, though something in her eyes betrayed the effort it cost her. "The storm has passed," she said, though rain still fell steadily outside. "I should return to my quarters before curfew." Xavier accepted his jacket without touching her fingers. Of course. She gathered her personal belongings with efficient movements, restoring order to the chaos of their work and emotions. At the door, she paused. "We have created something important together," she said quietly. "Something that may truly help the Empire navigate its cultural complexities. I would not wish to jeopardize that work." "Nor would I," Xavier replied, though the work no longer seemed the most precious thing at risk. After she left, Xavier remained in the study, the scent of lavender still lingering in the air. On the table lay a small notebook that Daria had forgotten in her haste, her personal observations on the Hungarian delegation's cultural priorities. He picked it up, intending to return it at their next meeting, and noticed a loose page tucked inside. It was a poem, written in Daria's neat hand, dated that very morning. "In shadows long I made my peace, with silence as my only voice, until your eyes found mine and held a question I dared not answer. The distance between stars is measured, not in miles but in light. How long before brightness born reaches across the void, and should that light touch darkness, what transformation might occur? What constellation newly formed? From bodies never meant to meet?" Xavier closed the notebook gently, a heaviness settling in his chest. The poem revealed what Daria's carefully maintained composure had concealed, that her feelings matched his own, and that she, too, understood the impossibility of their situation. In the imperial court, stars did not rewrite their courses. The constellation of power, position, and protocol that had governed Habsburg rule for centuries would not be realigned for the sake of two hearts that had recognized each other across an unbridgeable divide. And yet, as he extinguished the lamp and left the study, Xavier carried with him the dangerous knowledge that some impossibilities, once glimpsed, could never be forgotten. The Millennium Exhibition opened with imperial splendor, transforming the Volksgarten into a celebration of the empire's cultural diversity. Pavilions representing each major region displayed traditional crafts, musical performances echoed through the gardens, and diplomatic goodwill flowed as freely as the champagne. Emperor Franz Joseph himself toured the exhibition on opening day, his entourage of officials and dignitaries following as he stopped to examine displays and greet representatives from across his domains. Xavier walked 3 paces behind the emperor, ready to provide information or context as needed. "The linguistic heritage display," the emperor said as they approached a pavilion where maps and interactive demonstrations showed the evolution and interrelation of the empire's languages. "This was Professor Voss's concept, was it not?" "Yes, Your Majesty," Xavier replied. "Expanded and implemented by his daughter." The emperor nodded approvingly. "Have her brought here. I wish to acknowledge her contribution." Xavier felt a flutter of alarm. "Your Majesty, Fräulein Voss is not officially. I am aware of her position, Rothenberg." The emperor's tone brooked no argument. "Nevertheless, credit should be given where due. See to it." "At once, Your Majesty." Xavier dispatched a palace guard to locate Daria, then followed the emperor into the pavilion. Inside, visitors engaged with displays showing how trade routes had created linguistic exchanges, how shared words revealed cultural connections, and how understanding these patterns might foster greater imperial unity. When Daria arrived 15 minutes later, she was breathless and flustered, clearly having been summoned from her duties. She wore her servant's uniform, her hair neatly pinned beneath a cap, her expression a mixture of confusion and alarm. "Your Majesty." She curtsied deeply, keeping her eyes lowered. "You requested my presence?" The emperor, who had been examining a map of dialectical variations across the empire, turned to her. "Fräulein Voss, your work has exceeded expectations." Daria remained in her curtsy, uncertainty written across her features. "Thank you, Your Majesty. I only hope to honor my father's research." "Rise, child. This is no place for servile postures." The emperor's voice was gruff, but not unkind. "Walk with me." Explain this display on Hungarian-Romanian linguistic exchange. Astonished whispers rippled through the entourage as the emperor gestured for Daria to accompany him. She rose, throwing a panicked glance at Xavier, who gave her an encouraging nod. As they moved through the exhibition, Daria's initial terror gradually gave way to scholarly passion. She explained concepts with increasing confidence, answering the emperor's occasional questions with clarity and insight. Xavier watched with quiet pride as nobles and officials who had never spared her a glance now listened attentively to her words. "The common words for family relationships are particularly revealing," she was saying, pointing to a display. "Terms for brother, sister, mother often resist change even when other vocabulary evolves. They show how deeply connection matters across cultural divisions." "A poetic observation," the emperor commented, "and a politically useful one." When they had completed the tour, the emperor turned to address Count Andrusy and the Hungarian delegation who had joined them. "Gentlemen, what you have witnessed is the kind of scholarship that strengthens our dual monarchy, not through force or decree, but through genuine understanding." Count Andrusy, a tall man with penetrating eyes and an impressive mustache, nodded thoughtfully. "Indeed, Your Majesty. The young lady's insights on Hungarian linguistic sovereignty while maintaining imperial connection are surprisingly nuanced." The emperor turned back to Daria. "Fräulein Voss, Count Andrusy oversees cultural education initiatives in Budapest. I believe he may have an interest in your father's methodologies." Daria's eyes widened as she understood the implication. "It would be an honor to discuss them with the Count, Your Majesty." "Good. Rothenberg will make the arrangements." The emperor gave her a final, appraising look. "You have done your father proud, Fräulein, and provided a valuable service to your emperor." As the imperial party moved on, Daria remained rooted in place, overwhelmed by what had just occurred. Xavier approached her, careful to maintain a professional distance despite his desire to take her hands in his. "You were magnificent," he said quietly. "I can't believe that happened." Her voice trembled slightly. Everyone was watching. Baroness Keller looked as though she might faint from shock. Xavier smiled. "The Baroness has survived greater shocks. This may actually improve her opinion of the serving staff. Count Andrusy wants to discuss my father's work." Daria's voice held wonder and disbelief in equal measure. "A Hungarian count. The emperor has opened a door," Xavier said carefully. "What happens next depends on how boldly you choose to step through it." Their eyes met, and in that moment, the unspoken truth between them hung in the air, that the door opening for Daria's academic recognition might simultaneously be closing on the fragile connection they had formed. Herr Rothenberg. A palisade approached. "The Russian ambassador requests His Majesty's attention at the Slavic pavilion." "I'll be right there." Xavier turned back to Daria. "We'll speak later. My office, after the exhibition closes." She nodded, composed once more though her eyes still shone with emotion. "Thank you, Xavier, for everything." As he hurried to rejoin the emperor, Xavier felt both elation and dread. He had helped Daria achieve the recognition her father's work and her own contributions deserved. Yet in doing so, he may have set in motion events that would take her beyond his reach forever. The bitter irony was not lost on him. In helping her become visible to the world, he might lose the privilege of being the one who truly saw her. Autumn painted Vienna in russet and gold, the imperial gardens shedding their summer splendor as the city prepared for the approaching winter. For Daria, the changing season mirrored the transformation in her own life. Beautiful and terrifying, full of falling away and uncertain promise. Count Andrusy's interest in her father's work had evolved into a formal position at the Hungarian National Museum in Budapest. She would catalog and expand the linguistic archives, with a special focus on cultural preservation across the empire's eastern territories. The position came with a modest but respectable salary, housing for her family, and most precious of all, recognition of her scholarly abilities. You leave in 3 days? Xavier asked, his voice carefully neutral as they sat in his office, finalizing the transfer of research materials. Yes. Mother and my siblings are already preparing our things. Daria kept her eyes on the documents before her. The Count has arranged temporary quarters until more permanent housing can be secured. The Hungarian winter is harsh. You'll need warmer clothing than Vienna requires. The Countess Festetics has been unexpectedly generous. She provided a stipend for practical necessities. Daria's smile held a hint of irony. Apparently, once the Emperor himself acknowledges your existence, even those who looked through you for years suddenly discover your worth. Xavier flinched slightly at her words. Daria, forgive me. She sighed. That was uncharitable. The Countess has been kind, and I am grateful for the opportunity. It's just that recognition should have come much sooner, Xavier finished for her. That your worth should never have required imperial validation to be seen. Yes. She looked up at him then, her composure slipping for the first time in weeks. Though not everyone was blind to it. The acknowledgement hung between them, dangerous in its honesty. Since the exhibition, they had maintained a careful professional distance, both aware that Daria's changing circumstances created not fewer complications, but different ones. Budapest is not so very far, Xavier said, though they both knew the distance that mattered was not measured in miles. The Emperor often visits the Hungarian capital. And will you accompany him on these visits, Herr Rothenberg? Daria's use of his formal address was deliberate, a reminder of the boundaries they had established. When duties require it. He closed the portfolio between them. The Cultural Commission will continue its work. Your insights would still be valued. I will always be available to serve the Empire's interests. She rose, smoothing her skirt, no longer a servant's uniform, but a modest-day dress befitting her new position. Is there anything else required before my departure? Xavier wanted to say so much, about how her quiet courage had inspired him, how her mind had challenged him, how her presence had awakened something he had never known was sleeping. Instead, he simply said, the Emperor has requested a final report on the exhibition's impact. Would you be willing to contribute your observations? Of course. She hesitated, then added softly. It would give us reason to correspond. The admission, small as it was, pierced through Xavier's carefully maintained reserve. Daria, a knock at the door interrupted him. His secretary entered, bowing apologetically. Forgive the intrusion, Herr Rothenberg. The Minister of Foreign Affairs requires your immediate presence. The Serbian envoy has arrived earlier than expected. Thank you, Heinrich. Tell the minister I'll join him shortly. When the secretary had gone, Xavier turned back to Daria. Duty calls, as always. As it should. She gathered her belongings. The Empire's needs must come before personal considerations. Must they? Always. The question escaped before he could stop it. Daria looked at him with gentle reproach. You know they must. For people like us. And what are we, Daria? Beyond our duties and positions. We are, she faltered, searching for words that would not betray too much. We are two people who recognize something in each other. Something rare and valuable. Something that cannot be. Xavier moved toward her, propriety momentarily forgotten. Cannot be, or must not be. Is there a difference? Her voice was barely a whisper. All the difference in the world. He stopped just short of touching her. One is impossibility. The other is choice. Daria's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. Then it must not be, Xavier. For both our sakes. She stepped back, restoring the proper distance between them. I should go? There are still many preparations before my departure. Of course. Xavier returned to his desk, regaining his composure. I wish you every success in Budapest, Fräulein Voss. Your father's legacy, and your own contributions, deserve nothing less. Thank you. She moved to the door, then paused, looking back at him with a smile that contained both sorrow and gratitude. For seeing me, Xavier. When no one else did. After she had gone, Xavier remained at his desk, staring at the space she had occupied. The Serbian envoy could wait another moment. For now, he needed to acknowledge the truth he had been avoiding for months. He loved her, not as a curiosity or an intellectual equal, though she was certainly that. Not as a project or a protégé. but as a woman whose quiet strength and luminous mind had transformed his understanding of what mattered most. And he had let her walk away because the empire, duty, and the immutable laws of their society demanded it. Outside his window, leaves drifted from the palace linden trees, surrendering to the inevitable cycle of seasons. Xavier watched them fall, understanding for the first time how something could be both beautiful and heartbreaking in the same moment. Winter descended upon Vienna with unusual severity, burying the city under snow and ice. Inside the palace, life continued in its ordered patterns, though for Xavier, everything had changed. He performed his duties with the same efficiency as always, but those who knew him well noticed a new reserve in his manner, a distance that had not been there before. "You seem preoccupied these days," Rothenberg observed Foreign Minister Galachowski as they left a cabinet meeting. "Not falling victim to winter melancholy, I hope?" "Not at all, Minister. Simply focused on the spring diplomatic schedule." Xavier gathered his papers, avoiding the older man's perceptive gaze. Well, take care not to focus so intently on the future that you miss the present." The minister paused. "By the way, I received an interesting report from Budapest. The linguistic preservation project at the National Museum is apparently yielding impressive results. The Hungarian nobility are actually praising a Vienna-initiated cultural program, a minor miracle." Xavier's hand stilled. "I'm pleased to hear it. The young Voss woman has proven quite capable. Count Andrusy speaks highly of her methodologies." The minister studied Xavier's carefully neutral expression. "You recommended her for the position, did you not?" His Majesty recognized her potential. "I merely facilitated the arrangements." "Of course." The minister's tone suggested he understood more than Xavier wished to reveal. "Well, she's become something of a minor sensation in Budapest intellectual circles. Quite a journey from palace servant to cultural ambassador." Xavier managed a polite nod. "The empire benefits when talent is recognized, regardless of its origin." "Indeed." The minister gathered his coat. "The emperor travels to Budapest next month for the opera opening. Will you join the entourage?" The question, innocently posed, sent Xavier's pulse racing. "If His Majesty requires my presence." "I believe he will. The cultural committees from both capitals will be meeting to discuss the spring festivals." The minister smiled knowingly. "An opportunity to assess the linguistic project's progress firsthand, perhaps." After the minister departed, Xavier stood at his office window, watching snowflakes swirl against the darkening sky. 3 months had passed since Daria left for Budapest. 3 months of carefully worded official correspondence, of reports and proposals that revealed nothing of the writer's true thoughts. Yet between the lines of each document, in the selection of certain phrases or the emphasis on particular ideas, Xavier had found echoes of their conversations, private references that only he would recognize. Whether intentional or unconscious, these subtle connections had sustained him through the long winter weeks. The prospect of seeing her again filled him with both anticipation and dread. What would he find in Budapest? A woman transformed by recognition and purpose? Someone who had moved beyond their brief connection to embrace her new life fully? Or would he discover that the quiet understanding between them had endured, despite distance and circumstance? A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. His secretary entered with a telegram. "From Budapest, sir," marked urgent. Xavier opened it with steady hands that belied his inner tension. "Linguistic archives reveal unexpected historical patterns. Stop. Request imperial permission. To access restricted historical documents. Stop. Findings may have significant implications for millennium narrative. Stop. Voss." Beneath the terse official language, Xavier sensed urgency and excitement. Whatever Daria had discovered in the Hungarian archives was important enough to risk requesting access to sensitive imperial records. Such permission was rarely granted, especially to someone of her background and recent appointment. Yet the telegram also contained something more personal, the first direct communication from Daria that hadn't passed through multiple official channels. She had telegraphed his office directly, bypassing the Cultural Committee's bureaucracy. Xavier drafted his response immediately. Permission request forwarded to His Majesty. Stop. Imperial visit to Budapest confirmed for February 15th. Stop. Prepare full briefing for presentation. Stop. Rothenberg. He hesitated, then added a personal postscript. Winter in Vienna, unusually harsh stop, trust Budapest, more hospitable stop XR, as he handed the telegram to his secretary. Xavier felt a small thrill of anticipation. Whatever Daria had discovered would provide legitimate reason for direct consultation during the emperor's visit. For the first time in months, duty and desire aligned rather than opposed each other. Whether that alignment would bring resolution or merely sharpen the pain of impossibility remained to be seen. Budapest glittered under February sunshine, the Danube flowing between Buda's hills and Pest's elegant boulevards like a silver ribbon tying together the two halves of Hungary's capital. The imperial train arrived to ceremonial fanfare, Hungarian nobles and Austrian officials mingling in a display of dual monarchy solidarity as Emperor Franz Joseph descended to greet his Hungarian subjects. Xavier followed in the imperial entourage, his eyes scanning the assembled dignitaries for a familiar face. He didn't see Daria among the official welcoming party, which was unsurprising given her position, but disappointment settled in his chest nonetheless. The emperor's schedule for the first day was filled with formal obligations, meetings with Hungarian ministers, a luncheon with aristocratic families, and an inspection of new parliamentary buildings. By evening, when the imperial party retired to the royal palace in Buda, Xavier had still not caught a glimpse of the woman whose discovered research had partly precipitated this visit. Rothenberg, the emperor addressed him as attendants prepared for the evening reception. The museum director and his researchers will present their findings tomorrow morning. Ensure all relevant imperial documents are available for comparison. Yes, Your Majesty. I've brought the files requested from the Hofburg archives. Good. The emperor adjusted his uniform jacket. This linguistic research, you've reviewed the preliminary reports? I have, Your Majesty. Fräulein Voss has uncovered evidence of deliberate linguistic adaptation during the Ottoman occupation period. It appears Hungarian nobles preserved certain cultural elements by integrating them into official Habsburg communications in ways that went unnoticed by Vienna. The emperor raised an eyebrow. Fascinating, and potentially sensitive, depending on how it's interpreted. The research suggests mutual adaptation, Your Majesty, not resistance or deception, but cultural preservation through integration. It actually supports the millennium narrative of Hungarian resilience within imperial structure. Clever girl, the emperor murmured. She found a way to honor Hungarian identity while reinforcing imperial unity. The evidence appears to support that conclusion, yes. I look forward to the presentation. The emperor fixed Xavier with a penetrating look, and to seeing how Fräulein Voss has fared in her new position. You maintained correspondence with her department, I understand. Official correspondence only, Your Majesty, Xavier replied carefully. Of course. Something like amusement flickered in the emperor's aged eyes. One must maintain proper protocols. The following morning, Xavier arrived at the National Museum ahead of the imperial party to ensure all arrangements were in order. The grand building, with its neoclassical columns and sweeping steps, housed the treasures of Hungarian cultural heritage. Inside, museum staff hurried to make final preparations for the emperor's visit. Xavier was directed to a large research room where maps and documents had been carefully arranged for presentation. And there, bent over a large table, comparing notes with an elderly archivist, was Daria. She wore a simple but elegant day dress in deep blue, her hair arranged more fashionably than he remembered. She looked confident, engaged in her element as she gestured to various documents, explaining something to her colleague with animated precision. For a moment, Xavier simply watched her, unwilling to interrupt the tableau. This was what he had hoped for her: recognition, purpose, the chance to fully exercise her remarkable mind. The sight filled him with a complex mixture of pride, joy, and wistful regret. Then she looked up and saw him. Herr Rothenberg. Her professional greeting betrayed nothing, though her eyes widened slightly. We weren't expecting the imperial party for another hour. I came ahead to ensure all was in readiness, Fräulein Voss. He matched her formal tone, aware of the archivist's curious gaze. His Majesty is most interested in your discoveries. We are prepared. She turned to her colleague. Professor Nagy, may I present Herr Xavier Rothenberg, undersecretary to the imperial cabinet. Herr Rothenberg, Professor István Nagy, chief archivist of Hungarian national literature. The elderly professor bowed slightly. An honor, Herr Rothenberg. Fräulein Voss speaks highly of your contribution to the Cultural Preservation Initiative. The honor is mine, Professor, and any contributions I made were minor compared to Fräulein Voss's insights. She is a remarkable scholar, Nagy agreed. When Count Andrusy first introduced her, I confess I had reservations. A young woman with no formal university training, and Viennese at that. He chuckled. She proved me thoroughly wrong within a week. Daria's cheeks colored slightly at the praise. Professor Nagy has been an invaluable mentor. His knowledge of Hungarian literary history made these discoveries possible. Too modest, as always, Nagy patted her hand affectionately. I will check on the display preparations in the main hall. Herr Rothenberg, a pleasure. He shuffled from the room, leaving them alone. For a moment, neither spoke. Then, simultaneously, you look well. I trust your journey. They stopped, shared a small smile at the awkward beginning. You first, Xavier said gently. Daria took a breath. I was going to say, I trust your journey was comfortable. The winter has made travel difficult at times. The imperial train has certain advantages over public transportation. He stepped closer to the table, examining the documents laid out there. Your work here seems to be progressing remarkably well. It has been transformative. Something in her voice made him look up. To be valued for my mind, to have my ideas taken seriously. I can never adequately thank you for your part in making that possible. You earned this position through your own merit, Daria. Perhaps, but merit alone rarely opens doors. Her eyes met his directly. You helped the Emperor see what others overlooked. That changed everything for me, for my family. How are they settling in Budapest? Well, better than I dared hope. My mother's health has improved with better living conditions. My brothers are in school now, my sister training as a seamstress. She smiled. We have a small apartment near the university quarter. Nothing grand, but with actual windows and a tiny balcony. Sometimes I still can't believe it's real. The happiness in her voice warmed him, even as it emphasized the distance between them. I'm glad, Daria. Truly. She seemed about to say more when voices in the corridor announced the imminent arrival of the imperial party. Instantly, her expression composed itself into professional neutrality. The documents you requested from Vienna, she asked, all personal connections submerged beneath official purpose. Xavier opened his portfolio. Here. The original correspondence between Emperor Leopold I and the Hungarian Palatines during the Ottoman retreat. As they arranged the documents together, their hands occasionally brushed. Each fleeting contact sent awareness shimmering between them, but their faces revealed nothing as museum officials and imperial attendants began filing into the room. The presentation itself was a remarkable success. Daria explained her findings with clarity and confidence, showing how Hungarian nobles had preserved their cultural identity even while appearing to adopt Habsburg conventions. The linguistic patterns she had discovered revealed a sophisticated strategy of cultural resilience that had gone unnoticed for centuries. Rather than resistance through rejection, she explained as the emperor examined the documents, the Hungarian nobility practiced preservation through integration. They appeared to adopt German administrative terminology, but subtly modified it to retain Hungarian linguistic patterns. Over time, this created a unique administrative language that served both imperial efficiency and Hungarian identity. Fascinating, the emperor said, genuinely engaged. And you believe this pattern exists throughout the empire? The preliminary evidence suggests similar adaptations in Croatian, Czech, and Romanian territories, Your Majesty, each with their own unique characteristics, but following similar patterns of cultural preservation within imperial structures. Count Andrusy, standing at the emperor's right hand, nodded approvingly. It demonstrates the resilience of our peoples, Your Majesty, not through rebellion, but through adaptation and preservation. A useful narrative for our current situation, the emperor observed dryly. Though I suspect the reality was less harmonious than these documents suggest. Undoubtedly, Your Majesty, Daria acknowledged. These were strategies born of necessity, not preference. But they demonstrate that cultural identity and imperial unity need not be mutually exclusive. The emperor studied her for a moment, then turned to Count Andrusy. Your museum has made an excellent acquisition in Fräulein Voss, Count. Vienna's loss is Budapest's gain. Indeed, Your Majesty. She has brought fresh perspective to our understanding of Hungarian cultural history. As the presentation concluded and the imperial party prepared to move on, the emperor paused beside Xavier. Arrange for Fräulein Voss to attend the opera reception tonight. I would like to discuss these findings further. Yes, Your Majesty. Xavier bowed, his pulse quickening at the unexpected directive. When the emperor and his entourage had departed, Daria approached Xavier, her expression a mixture of disbelief and apprehension. Did His Majesty just request your presence at tonight's reception? Yes. Xavier kept his voice low, aware of museum staff still clearing the room. It's a significant honor. It's terrifying, she whispered. I have nothing suitable to wear to an imperial reception. I don't know the proper protocols for such an event. The invitation will include an allowance for appropriate attire. As for protocols, Xavier hesitated, then added, I could brief you, if you wish. This afternoon, perhaps? Relief flooded her features. Would you? I would be eternally grateful. The imperial party rests until 4. I could meet you at 3, if that suits. Yes. There's a cafe near the museum, Gerbode. It's respectable, but not too formal. I know it. 3 o'clock, then. As they parted, Xavier felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in months. The emperor's invitation had created a legitimate reason for their meeting, a purpose that even the most stringent propriety could not question. For a few hours, at least, they could set aside the complexities of their situation and simply enjoy each other's company. Whether that would ease the ache of separation or merely sharpen it remained to be seen. Café Gerbode bustled with afternoon patrons, its mirrors and marble-topped tables reflecting Budapest's elegant society at leisure. Xavier arrived precisely at 3, securing a quiet table in the corner where they could speak without being overheard. Daria appeared moments later, slightly breathless, her cheeks flushed from the cold February air. She had changed from her formal presentation attire into a simpler walking dress, though she still carried herself with the newfound confidence Xavier had noticed that morning. Forgive my lateness, she said, sliding into the chair opposite him. Professor Nagy had additional questions about the presentation. You're not late at all. Xavier signaled a waiter. The professor seemed impressed by your work. He's been incredibly supportive. When I first arrived, many at the museum viewed me with suspicion, a Viennese woman sent by the emperor himself. They assumed I was some sort of imperial spy. She smiled at the memory. Professor Nagy was the first to actually read my work rather than judge my origins. The waiter approached, and Xavier ordered coffee for them both, along with the cafe's famous pastries. And now, how are you viewed after 3 months? With less suspicion, certainly. My Hungarian is improving, which helps considerably, and the discovery of these linguistic patterns has earned some respect. She adjusted her gloves, a small nervous gesture. But I remain an outsider in many ways, not quite belonging to either world anymore. The simple observation carried a weight of loneliness that resonated with Xavier's own experience of the past months. He, too, had felt caught between worlds, performing his duties with outward perfection while his thoughts often strayed to Budapest. Your family has adjusted well, you said? Yes, thankfully. My mother has made friends among the local shopkeepers. My brothers attend the gymnasium. Their Hungarian is already better than mine. Her expression softened with affection. My sister has discovered a talent for embroidery that has attracted attention from several fashion houses. And you? Beyond your work, have you found Budapest welcoming? Daria considered this as their coffee arrived. The city is beautiful, more vibrant than Vienna in some ways, more openly passionate. The people speak their minds with less concern for propriety. She added sugar to her coffee, stirring slowly. But I miss certain things about Vienna. The palace gardens? Xavier suggested, remembering how she had once mentioned finding peace there during early morning hours before the court awoke. Those, yes. She looked up, meeting his eyes directly. And other things. The simple acknowledgement hung between them, neither elaborating on what those other things might be. Now, she said, clearly changing the subject, you promised to prepare me for tonight's reception. I confess I'm terrified of making some horrible faux pas that disgraces the museum and confirms every Hungarian suspicion about Viennese arrogance. Xavier smiled, accepting the shift to safer ground. First, you should know that the emperor prefers straightforward conversation to excessive flattery. Address him as your imperial and royal apostolic majesty initially, then your majesty thereafter. For the next hour, they discussed court protocols, seating arrangements, and the delicate politics of the dual monarchy's social functions. Daria listened attentively, occasionally making notes in a small book she produced from her reticule. The Hungarian aristocracy will be watching closely, Xavier explained. They'll be curious about your position at the museum and your relationship to Vienna. Some may try to elicit politically uncomfortable statements. How should I respond? With scholarly neutrality. Emphasize the cultural significance of your findings rather than any political implications. The emperor appreciates intellectual honesty, but diplomatic sensitivity as well. Their conversation flowed with an ease that belied their months apart, shifting between practical advice and shared observations about Hungarian customs. As they finished their pastries, Daria glanced at the clock on the cafe wall. I should go soon. The dressmaker will be waiting, and I'll need time to prepare. Of course. Xavier signaled for the bill, then hesitated before adding, You'll do beautifully tonight, Daria. Just be the scholar who impressed the emperor this morning. And if I'm asked about my unusual journey from palace servant to imperial reception guest, the truth is always simplest. Your father's work came to His Majesty's attention. Your own abilities proved worthy of development. The empire benefits when talent is recognized, regardless of its origin. She smiled at his echo of the words he had spoken to Minister Galachowski months before. A diplomatic answer, but an honest one nonetheless. As they prepared to leave, Daria hesitated. Xavier, she stopped, seeming to reconsider her words. Thank you for this, for your guidance, and for taking time from your duties. He understood what she hadn't said, the gratitude not just for practical advice, but for the precious hour of normalcy, of connection without scrutiny or judgment. It was my pleasure, Daria. He stood, offering a formal bow that concealed the depth of his feelings. Until tonight. The Budapest Opera House blazed with light, its neo-Renaissance facade transformed into a beacon that drew carriages from across the city. Inside, Hungary's nobility mingled with Vienna's elite under crystal chandeliers, their conversations forming a melodic counterpoint to the orchestra playing in the grand foyer. Xavier stood near the emperor's reception line, observing the careful choreography of power and prestige as guests were presented to Franz Joseph. The Hungarian magnates made their obeisance with proud dignity, acknowledging their king while subtly asserting their own ancient lineages. The Viennese courtiers responded with practiced deference that nevertheless conveyed Habsburg superiority. It was the eternal dance of the dual monarchy, formal unity masking the underlying tensions that threatened to tear the empire apart. And then, announced with minimal ceremony, she appeared. Fräulein Daria Voss, researcher at the Hungarian National Museum. Xavier's breath caught. Daria wore a gown of deep emerald silk, simple by aristocratic standards, but elegantly cut to frame her slender figure. Her hair was arranged in a sophisticated style that softened her features, and a modest pendant, probably borrowed, adorned her throat. She looked composed, beautiful in an understated way that drew several appreciative glances from nearby courtiers. She approached the emperor with perfect poise, executing a deep curtsy before rising at his gesture. Fräulein Voss, you've caused quite a stir among my Hungarian ministers today. The emperor's tone was approving rather than critical. I hope the disturbance was not unwelcome, Your Majesty. Her voice carried clearly despite its softness. On the contrary, fresh perspectives are valuable, particularly when they offer paths to understanding rather than division. The emperor gestured to Count Andrusy, who stood nearby. The count tells me you've proposed expanding your research to include Romanian and Croatian territories. With Your Majesty's permission, yes. The patterns we've identified suggest similar linguistic adaptations throughout the empire's eastern regions. Permission granted. Rothenberg will ensure you have access to the necessary imperial archives. Daria's eyes briefly sought Xavier in the crowd before returning to the emperor. Thank you, Your Majesty. The museum is honored by your support. As she moved away from the reception line, Xavier watched her navigate the unfamiliar social terrain with careful dignity. She was approached by several Hungarian academics who had attended the morning presentation, then by a Viennese cultural minister clearly curious about the emperor's interest in her work. Throughout these exchanges, she maintained the perfect balance he had advised, scholarly passion tempered by diplomatic discretion, confidence without presumption. She belonged in this gathering not by birth or rank, but by the strength of her mind and the value of her contributions. The orchestra began the opening strains of a Strauss waltz, signaling the commencement of dancing. Xavier hesitated, knowing that propriety dictated he should not be her first partner at such an event. That honor would likely go to Professor Nagy or perhaps a museum director, someone whose attention would not spark unnecessary speculation. As if summoned by his thoughts, the elderly professor appeared at Daria's side, offering his arm with grandfatherly affection. She accepted with a warm smile, allowing him to lead her into the forming sets. They made an incongruous pair, the stooped academic and his youthful protege, but the genuine respect between them was evident to all who observed. "Your protege seems to be adapting well to elevated company," came a voice at Xavier's shoulder. He turned to find Minister Galachowski regarding him with shrewd assessment. "She is a credit to the Imperial Cultural Initiative, Minister." "Indeed." The older man sipped his champagne. "Though I wonder if Budapest will satisfy her ambitions indefinitely. Talent such as hers often seeks broader horizons." "Fräulein Voss strikes me as someone who values purpose over ambition," Xavier replied carefully. "Perhaps, but purpose can take many forms." The minister's gaze followed Daria as she completed her dance with Professor Nagy. "The Imperial University in Vienna has expressed interest in her research methodology. Chancellor Kielmansegg mentioned it just this morning." Xavier kept his expression neutral despite the surge of hope this information triggered. The university that rejected her father's work now courts his daughters? There's a certain irony there. The world turns, Rothenberg. Today's radical is tomorrow's visionary. The minister smiled slightly. "Though in this case, I suspect the emperor's evident approval has accelerated the recognition process considerably." As the dance concluded, Xavier saw his opportunity. With a respectful nod to the minister, he moved through the crowd until he stood before Daria, who had just thanked Professor Nagy for the dance. "Fräulein Voss," he bowed formally. "Might I have the honor of the next dance?" Something flickered in her eyes, surprise, pleasure, momentary concern, before she composed her features into polite acceptance. "The honor would be mine, Herr Rothenberg." As the orchestra began a slower waltz, Xavier guided her onto the floor, maintaining the proper distance between them as they joined the swirling couples. "You're causing quite a sensation," he murmured, nodding towards several observing diplomats. "The mysterious scholar who captured the emperor's interest." "Hardly mysterious," she replied, following his lead with unexpected grace. "Merely fortunate in my advocates." "Your advocates merely opened doors. You walked through them on your own merit." His hand at her waist registered the slight tremble that contradicted her outward composure. "Are you nervous?" "Terrified," she admitted with a small smile. "I counted at least 3 archduchesses and a dozen counts before I stopped trying to identify ranks. I keep expecting someone to demand what a former servant is doing among the imperial elite. No one who heard your presentation this morning would question your place here." They turned in perfect synchrony, the movement bringing her momentarily closer before the formal pattern of the dance separated them again. "Minister Galachowski mentioned that the Imperial University has expressed interest in your research," Xavier said when they rejoined. Surprise widened her eyes. "In Vienna? I hadn't heard. Apparently Chancellor Kielmansegg was impressed by the reports of your work." "That seems unlikely." Doubt colored her voice. "The Chancellor was one of my father's most vocal critics." As the minister observed, today's radical is tomorrow's visionary. Xavier guided her through a turn, lowering his voice. "Especially when the emperor himself expresses approval." Understanding dawned in her expression. "You think the university's interest is political rather than academic?" "I think it's both. Your work has genuine merit, but the emperor's favor has made recognizing that merit suddenly fashionable." The music swelled around them as they completed another circuit of the floor. Daria's hand rested lightly in his, her steps matching his with increasing confidence as they spoke. "Would you consider it?" Xavier asked, the question carrying more weight than its simple words suggested. "Returning to Vienna?" She met his gaze directly, something vulnerable and honest breaking through her carefully maintained poise. "Would you want me to?" The directness of her question, and all it implied, momentarily robbed him of words. In the pause that followed, the music reached its crescendo and began to fade, forcing them to complete the dance without his answer. As the final notes sounded, they stood facing each other, hands still joined, surrounded by couples applauding the orchestra, yet somehow apart from them all. "Yes," Xavier said finally, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "But what I want matters less than what would serve your future best." Before she could respond, Count Andrusy approached, requesting her presence for a conversation with several Hungarian cultural ministers. With a final glance at Xavier, filled with unspoken questions and possibilities, Daria accepted the Count's arm and was drawn away into the glittering crowd. Xavier watched her go, the brief warmth of her hand lingering in his like a promise, or perhaps a question, left tantalizingly unanswered. Spring arrived in Vienna with explosive beauty, the imperial gardens transformed by overnight blossoms that seemed to mirror the city's awakening spirits. The long winter had finally released its grip, and with the warming days came renewed diplomatic activity as the empire prepared for the season's state visits and cultural exchanges. For Xavier, the changing season brought increased responsibilities but little joy. Since returning from Budapest 2 months earlier, he had thrown himself into his duties with redoubled focus, earning commendation from the emperor but concerned glances from colleagues who noticed his diminished enthusiasm for the social aspects of court life. "The Hungarian cultural delegation arrives tomorrow," Minister Galachowski remarked as they left a cabinet meeting. "Count Andrusy brings a rather substantial entourage this time." "Yes, Minister. The arrangements are complete." Xavier consulted his notebook. "They'll be received at Schönbrunn at 11, followed by the Cultural Commission meeting at 2, and the special research presentation at 4. The minister gave him a sidelong glance. "I understand Fräulein Voss will be leading that portion of the program." Xavier maintained his professional composure despite the sudden acceleration of his pulse. "So I'm informed. Her expanded research has apparently yielded significant insights into Croatian-Hungarian linguistic patterns." "Indeed. Chancellor Kielmansegg is quite eager to discuss university affiliations with her." The minister paused. "You've maintained correspondence with the Budapest team, I believe?" "Official correspondence only, Minister. The Cultural Commission requires regular updates." "Of course." The older man's knowing expression suggested he understood more than Xavier had revealed. "Well, it will be interesting to see how our former palace servant has progressed in her academic role. Quite a remarkable journey." "Indeed," Xavier agreed, carefully neutral. "The empire benefits when talent finds its proper application." After the minister departed, Xavier returned to his office, closing the door against the bustle of preparations. Tomorrow, after 2 months of carefully worded official reports and diplomatic updates, he would see her again. The prospect filled him with both anticipation and dread. Their last conversation at the Budapest Opera reception had left so much unspoken. His admission that he wanted her to return to Vienna had been truncated by circumstances before they could explore what such a return might mean, for her career, for his position, for the connection between them that defied easy categorization. In the intervening weeks, he had received one personal note from her, delivered discreetly by Professor Nagy during a brief Vienna visit. Its contents had been both proper and profound. Xavier, Budapest blooms differently than Vienna, with more abandon and less precision. The museum work continues to challenge and fulfill me, though I find myself comparing everything to what I left behind. The university's interest is both flattering and disconcerting. To be courted by the institution that rejected my father's work seems a strange form of justice. Professor Nagy advises me to consider it seriously, though Count Andrusy seems reluctant to lose his cultural asset to Vienna. I find myself at another crossroads, similar to yet different from the one where we first met. Then, I was invisible and searching for recognition. Now, I am seen, perhaps too clearly, and searching for the right path forward. Some paths appear advantageous, but feel wrong. Others seem difficult, but call to something deeper within. How does one choose? I will be in Vienna with the Hungarian delegation in early spring. Perhaps by then, the path will be clearer. With gratitude and regard. Daria Xavier had read the letter countless times, searching for guidance in its carefully chosen words. She sought his counsel, clearly, but also something more, his perspective on possibilities she could not directly name. He had drafted many responses, but sent none. Any written reply would either say too much or too little, creating a record of sentiments best expressed in person. So he had waited, focusing on the one certainty he could effect, ensuring that when the Hungarian delegation arrived, the path between them would be clear of administrative obstacles, if nothing else. Now, with her arrival imminent, Xavier found himself both prepared and entirely unready. The practical arrangements were impeccable: the cultural commission schedules, the research presentations, the formal receptions. But his own thoughts remained chaotic, torn between duty and desire, between the life he had built and the future he now found himself imagining. A knock at his door interrupted these reflections. His secretary entered, bearing a message. "From His Majesty, sir. He requests your presence immediately." Xavier tucked away his personal concerns and followed the secretary to the emperor's private study. Franz Joseph sat at his desk, reviewing documents with his characteristic thoroughness despite his advancing years. "Rothenberg." The emperor acknowledged him without looking up. "The Hungarian delegation's visit requires additional consideration." "Your Majesty?" "Chancellor Kielmansegg informs me that the university intends to offer Fräulein Voss a research position with the linguistics faculty." The emperor signed a document before continuing. "Count Andrusy, meanwhile, has expressed his desire to retain her services in Budapest. It seems our cultural bridge builder has become the object of institutional rivalry." Xavier maintained his professional demeanor despite his surprise. "Fräulein Voss's work has indeed proven valuable to both capitals, Your Majesty." "Indeed." The emperor finally looked up, his aged eyes sharp with assessment. "What is your evaluation of where her talents would best serve the empire?" The question, so direct, so consequential, momentarily caught Xavier off guard. The emperor was asking him to help determine Daria's future, a responsibility that both honored and terrified him. "Fräulein Voss has thrived in Budapest, Your Majesty. Her understanding of Hungarian cultural perspectives has deepened significantly." Xavier chose his words with care. "However, her research increasingly points toward the need for centralized access to imperial archives across multiple languages and territories. The university's resources might better support that broader scope." A diplomatic assessment. The emperor's expression revealed nothing. "And what of the woman herself? Where do you believe she would prefer to be placed?" The directness of the question surprised Xavier. The emperor rarely concerned himself with individual preferences in matters of imperial appointments. "I believe she values purpose above location, Your Majesty. The opportunity to continue her father's work and expand its application would be her primary concern. Not her only concern, perhaps." Something knowing flickered in the emperor's gaze. "I have observed that Fräulein Voss appears to have formed certain attachments during her time in Vienna." Xavier felt heat rise to his face despite his best efforts at composure. "Your Majesty? Come, Rothenberg. I am old, not blind." The emperor's tone held no censure, merely pragmatic observation. "The girl's academic value is clear. Her personal circumstances are her own affair, provided they do not interfere with her service to the empire." Unsure how to respond to this unexpected turn, Xavier remained silent. "I have decided," the emperor continued, apparently satisfied with whatever he had read in Xavier's expression, "to create a new position within the Cultural Commission. A senior researcher reporting directly to the commission rather than to either capital's institutions. The position would require travel between Vienna and Budapest, with access to all imperial archives." Understanding dawned slowly. The emperor was creating a role that would allow Daria to serve both cities without belonging exclusively to either. A solution that neatly avoided the institutional rivalry while expanding her academic opportunities. "A most innovative approach, Your Majesty." Innovation becomes necessary when tradition proves insufficient. The emperor returned to his documents. "You will present this option to Fräulein Voss during her visit. Emphasize that it represents the empire's recognition of her unique contributions rather than a compromise between competing interests." "Yes, Your Majesty." "And Rothenberg." The emperor glanced up one final time. "This arrangement would necessitate finding suitable permanent accommodation in Vienna for when her duties bring her to the capital. See that appropriate options are identified." "Of course, Your Majesty." As Xavier backed from the room, The implications of the emperor's directives settled over him like the first warmth of spring after a bitter winter. Franz Joseph, master of the empire's intricate bureaucracy, had just created a solution that addressed not only Daria's professional future, but the unspoken personal complications as well. A position that required travel between capitals, permanent accommodation in Vienna, reporting structures that bypassed traditional hierarchies, all presented as imperial necessity rather than personal accommodation. The emperor had seen what Xavier had tried so carefully to conceal, and had chosen to facilitate rather than obstruct. As he walked through the palace corridors, Xavier felt something he had not experienced in months: hope. Not the fragile hope of impossible dreams, but the solid possibility of a future where duty and desire. The sight filled him with pride and a strange sense of loss. This confident young scholar seemed worlds away from the invisible servant girl he had first noticed in the palace corridors. Had she moved beyond their connection as thoroughly as she had transcended her former circumstances? The formal reception proceeded with ritualized precision. Introductions, speeches, the careful dance of dual monarchy diplomacy that acknowledged Hungarian autonomy while reinforcing imperial unity. Xavier performed his role with practiced efficiency, though his awareness remained fixed on Daria, still waiting at the edges of the formal proceedings. When the reception concluded and the delegates dispersed to their various meetings, Xavier finally found his opportunity. Professor Nagy had been drawn into conversation with Austrian academics, leaving Daria momentarily alone as she examined a painting in the gallery adjoining the reception hall. Empress Maria Theresa reviewing Hungarian troops after her coronation in Pressburg, Xavier said quietly, approaching from behind. The artist took certain liberties with historical accuracy for the sake of dramatic composition. Daria turned, a smile lighting her features before she composed them into more appropriate greeting. Herr Rothenberg, how lovely to see you again. Fräulein Voss. He bowed formally, aware of nearby diplomats who might observe them. Welcome back to Vienna. I trust your journey was comfortable. Quite comfortable, thank you. Her eyes conveyed more than her polite words, though strange in some ways. To return as a guest rather than a servant. A well-deserved change in circumstances. Xavier glanced around, noting that they were now relatively unobserved as most delegates had moved toward the meeting rooms. I've been instructed to discuss a matter of some importance with you before your research presentation. Might I suggest the Imperial Gardens? The spring blooms are particularly fine this year. Understanding flickered in her expression. I would welcome some fresh air before the afternoon sessions. They walked in silence through the palace and out into the formal gardens, maintaining a proper distance until they reached a secluded path bordered by newly blossoming lilacs. Here, sheltered from casual observation, Xavier finally allowed himself to truly look at her. You look well, Daria. Budapest clearly agrees with you. In many ways, yes. She met his gaze directly, all pretense of formal distance falling away. Though not in all ways. The simple admission hung between them, acknowledging what neither had directly expressed in their months apart. I received your letter, Xavier said. I wanted to respond, but any written reply would have said too much or too little. She completed his thought with a small smile. I understand. Some conversations require presence, not correspondence. Yes. He gestured to a stone bench partially concealed by flowering shrubs. Shall we sit? What I need to discuss requires some explanation. As they settled on the bench, careful inches apart, Xavier outlined the emperor's proposal, the new position, its unique reporting structure, the division of time between capitals, the permanent accommodation in Vienna. His Majesty believes this arrangement would best serve the empire's cultural integration efforts, he concluded, watching her face carefully. It would allow your research to expand beyond Hungary while maintaining your connection to the Budapest Museum. Daria was silent for a long moment, her eyes focused on the distant palace. The emperor himself suggested this. He did. Why? She turned to him, her gaze searching. Such positions are not created on whim, even by emperors. Xavier hesitated, then decided on complete honesty. I believe His Majesty has observed more than either of us realized. About your value to the empire, and about other matters. Color rose in her cheeks as she understood his meaning. You think he knows about our connection? Xavier supplied when she faltered. Yes, I believe he does. and has chosen to accommodate rather than obstruct it. But why would he concern himself with such a personal matter? The emperor has ruled for over 50 years, Daria. He has sacrificed his personal happiness for imperial duty countless times. Xavier's voice softened. Perhaps, in his wisdom, he sees no reason why duty and happiness must always stand opposed. She looked down at her gloved hands, resting in her lap. This position, it would mean freedom from institutional rivalries. From having to choose between Vienna and Budapest. Yes, you would belong to the empire itself, not to any single institution within it. A citizen of the monarchy rather than of either capital. She smiled slightly. Like the linguistic patterns my father identified. Integration without erasure. Exactly. Xavier leaned forward slightly. The position is yours if you want it, Daria. But the choice must be yours alone. Your work in Budapest has flourished. You've earned respect there. No one would fault you for continuing that path. And if I chose this new position instead? Her voice was barely above a whisper. What then? The question hung between them, laden with meanings beyond professional considerations. Then you would return to Vienna, at least part of the time. Your family could remain in Budapest if they wished, or relocate. The stipend would support either arrangement. Xavier paused, then added more softly. And we would have the opportunity to discover what might be possible between us, without the constraints that separated us before. Daria stood suddenly, moving a few steps away to touch the delicate lilac blossoms beside the path. When I left Vienna, I was certain I would never return except as a visitor. That chapter of my life seemed closed forever. And now, she turned to face him, sunlight illuminating her features. Now I find myself wondering if perhaps it wasn't a closing at all, but merely a necessary interlude. A time of growth and change that prepared me for a different return than I could have imagined. Xavier rose, moving to stand before her. What will you tell the emperor? That I am honored by his confidence and accept the position with gratitude. A smile transformed her serious expression, and that I look forward to serving the empire's cultural integration efforts to the best of my abilities. A diplomatic response, Xavier observed, his own smile matching hers, but an honest one nonetheless. She echoed his words from their Budapest cafe meeting. For a moment they stood in silence, the garden around them vibrant with new life, the air sweet with the scent of blossoms. Then, with a glance to ensure they remained unobserved, Xavier reached for her hand, holding it briefly between both of his. Welcome home, Daria Voss. Her fingers tightened around his, the simple contact conveying more than elaborate declarations ever could. It seems the invisible girl has finally found her place in the empire. You were never truly invisible, Xavier said softly. Not to those who knew how to look. No. Her eyes held his, filled with quiet certainty. Not to you. As the palace clock chimed the hour, calling them back to duties and meetings, formal presentations, and diplomatic protocols, they shared one final look of perfect understanding before returning to their separate roles in the imperial pageantry. But now those roles existed within a new constellation, one where the distance between them had been acknowledged not as an unbridgeable void, but as a space across which light could travel, connecting separate bodies in patterns of meaning and possibility. In the emperor's vast dominions, where tradition and protocol governed every interaction, they had found something rare and precious, recognition that transcended position, connection that defied categorization, and the promise of a future where being truly seen by one who mattered made all the difference. The emperor might rule the empire, but in claiming her worth when others had overlooked it, Xavier had claimed something far more valuable, Daria's heart, freely given across all the boundaries that had once stood between them. And in the blooming gardens of Schönbrunn, as spring renewed the world around them, that was enough.